Good evening. I am Andrea Benidetti. I teach restoration at the University of Venice, and the topic that I will address is that related to the restoration and rebuilding of religious buildings. It is a delicate and complex topic that becomes very relevant in the debate and in the practice following the instructions, starting from those of the Second World War, and sadly also in the current context. I will anticipate that this topic cannot be distinguished easily from similar presentations and studies of similar types. So there could be some repetitions and juxtapositions with other questions that concern monumental buildings. The same applies to the restoration concepts in terms of standards and laws and possible reference on these topics. So I immediately say that I am sorry for some digressions that might not frame the issue related to religious buildings precisely. I will try to share a document, a presentation with some pictures which will accompany the reflections that we will do together. So I hope everything works. And I am about to show this presentation. So I hope that the photographs and the pictures are represented correctly. So let's start with this photograph, which is something that makes reference to the destructions of the First World War, but immediately let us consider the issues and elements that gave shape to the different attitudes vis-à-vis the results of the dramatic distractions due to the war. The topic clearly is related to the topic of values. Here I mentioned those who at the beginning of the 20th century so I make reference to those that described in depth the mechanism that led to the recognition of value in the context of monumental buildings. I make reference to Alois Riegel, who in 1903 wrote a book, The Modern Cult of Monuments. Its character and its origin, that is the introduction of a new system of protection in Austria. But I will not get into detail here. What is relevant for us is that there are different ways in which the concept of value appeared in the topics related to the protection of monuments, in particular the historic artistic value, the value of antiquity, meaning the values of memory that refer to the way in which our culture looks for references in the past, and then the contemporary values, in particular the relative artistic value. Basically, this make reference to a specific conception of an era, and they influence the ways in which we perceive and act on the conservation of architecture of the past. This is an educational presentation of those aspects, but when speaking about damaged buildings that are damaged by the war, we have to also make reference to something that is called psychological instance by some, meaning we need to make reference to the memory and the ways in which memory, especially collective memory, shapes itself and influences our actions, our perceptions, and in general our culture in the specific contexts that we are addressing now. Here we find three very important cultured personalities such as Paul Ricoeur, Maurice Halbwachs, and the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung that address topics that are related to the ways in which a conscience and a collective memory develop, and together with the value mechanism that I've just mentioned, they put into place mechanisms which then lead to actions in relation to the conservation goals of the architectures of the past that were seriously damaged by war events. So all those issues are related to the topics that we are about to address. It is not easy to decide how to address them. We could start from an assessment of the degrees of the damage which defines the situations in which architectures are set. In this case, we focus on the religious buildings, and so we could determine some standards for the specific interventions, for their conservation, for their reactivation from an architectural point of view. Let's start from the religious buildings that have been mildly damaged, and we will focus on some episodes after the bombings of the Second World War. Here we have St. Pierre Church in Caen. I will show these pictures very rapidly. This building had been damaged, but it hadn't lost its architectural general configuration that was rebuilt in the system of the covers. And here we see the Church of St. Stephen in Vienna. After the bombing, the cover was lost, meaning the cover of the central nave, and then it was rebuilt. If I'm not wrong, this was rebuilt with a metal structure, and this is a photograph taken after the Second World War. This is a photograph of the 50s, and this is the general united aspect of this architecture. So here we can see a situation that occurs when there are war damages on religious buildings that are mild, and in this case the recovery and restoration of these architectures, I will not use the word easily, but I can say that we can apply standards of restoration in a way that we could define as natural or technologically spontaneous. Then the situation is more complex in the case of more serious damages, and so we move to another category. In this case, we see some examples. This is Rome, San Lorenzo fuori le mura church. It is a basilica that was built in the 4th century with expansions in the 6th century and then in the 13th century, and also in the Baroque era. In 1943 it was bombed heavily. Here we can see some pictures of this. This was rebuilt by completing, giving back the architecture in its entirety. Then we will see other photographs. And so the architecture appears complete in terms of architectural forms and also in terms of internal ornaments. Those are episodes of reconstruction which tend to rebuild the architectural features that existed before the damage due to war events. The same kind of reasoning can be applied to Padua, the Church of the Eremitani, 13th century building, Romanic Gothic shapes, with chapels that were added subsequently, one of which has frescoes by Andrea Mantegna, and it was also affected by the same tragedy because it was bombed in 1944, and this led to a loss of a great part of its architectural configuration. Then it was rebuilt, as in the photograph that we saw previously, but then we will go back to this reflection later on. So here you can see Rome and San Lorenzo fuori le mura, and you can see the Church of the Eremitani in Padua. These are cases in which the activity of reconstruction after these serious damages and the approach tends to recreate the building as it was before the damage occurred. But there are situations in which the opportunity of reconstruction, and this happens quite often in different cases in Italy and in general in Europe, this also assumes a selective character, meaning this tends to the opportunity is seized, meaning the opportunity of the destruction due to the bombings, in order to enhance a historic phase that is considered more valuable compared to a following phase that is considered less valuable. This is the case of the Church of St. Francis in Viterbo. Here, basically, the shapes of the 600s are eliminated and the medieval part is recovered. Here you can see the building straight after the end of the restoration works. That is even more evident in Naples, in the Church of St. Clair. Here we can see a photograph of the building before. That's the big nave of the 14th century. In the 18th century, it became very Baroque. It became very pompous, and then this was heavily damaged. You can see it in this picture. And then during the phase of reconstruction, the Baroque aspect wasn't retrieved. Instead, if we consider the image of the building, we can see that the reconstruction went back in time, and presumably this intervention allowed to go back to its confirmation of the 14th century. Then there is something very interesting that happens when the damages are considered very serious, or even when we can consider the building as totally destroyed. Let's look at some cases. This is the Memorial Church in Berlin. That's the example we want to take into consideration. This is an 18th century building that was heavily bombed it was destroyed, actually, but any possibility of reconstruction wasn't taken into consideration. Instead, the ruin was kept, even though it lost its function, and next to it, new buildings were built with contemporary architectures, which collaborated in the general image of this architecture and allowed to resume its function. This is an intervention of the 60s with the design by Eyeman. These are other photographs that showed the moments before and after. Then there is another recurring case that is often presented when speaking about those topics, and that is the one related to the destruction of the Cathedral of Coventry, St. Michael Cathedral. In this case, just like in Berlin, the building is kept as a ruin and a new building is built. But we will speak about it more in depth later on. What is interesting here is that in the case of very serious damages up until destruction, the attitude that seems more frequent, as we've seen in the examples, is that of keeping what still remains as a ruin that is the symbol of a dramatic event, and then develop next to it a building that allows to carry out the old functions or the new functions within a new building. That is the result of a modern design that play in the language with what existed before. But that is not always what happens. Here there is another building that was destroyed partially. That is the Church of St. Benedict in Ferrara. Here you can see the photograph after the war events. Instead, this was rebuilt. So it wasn't kept as a ruin to then maybe develop the function with a building next to it with a contemporary language. Instead, it was rebuilt applying a technique of simplification of the shapes, but in some senses it is like a sad surrogate of this architecture. The same applies to the internal spaces. Here you can see a picture with the various ornaments inside the church before the damages, and in the other picture you can see the result that simplifies its complexity later on. So we can say that I've tried to show that based on the analysis of the seriousness of the damages, it is hard to identify recurring attitudes that make reference to an attitude that can be coded. So from this point of view, in relation to the last aspect, that of the total distraction, clearly we have to make reference today, even it is not related to religious buildings. Clearly we have to speak about Warsaw, as you probably know, this was completely destroyed and it was decided to rebuild it based on the documents, based on the paintings and the 57 paintings by Bernardo Bellotto, the grandson of Canaletto that lived in the 18th century, and by using architectural surveys, luckily made in the 30s by the University of Warsaw. So based on all of that, here you can see the photographs of the tragic events, and these are some of the pictures of some of the 57 paintings by Bernardo Bellotto. And here I will show you some photographs that show the result of the reconstruction that also led to a greater efficiency of the plans. In this way, the planimetric informations are more efficient. Anyhow, the architectural confirmation now meets the needs and desires of the community of Warsaw. Here you can see the reconstruction of the Church of the Sacrament of Warsaw. Also, these are attitudes of reconstruction that are not the only possible. Here in Danzica, you can see an example of reconstruction after war events. This reinterprets in a contemporary manner the volumetric confirmations of existing buildings. So in this case, there was a choice was made, and this choice has a goal, which is related to the collective memory that stimulates the reappropriation of shapes, materials, colors, and planimetric confirmations that the community deems essential, and the community doesn't want to give this up. So based on these first considerations and reflections, we can guess that based on categorization by seriousness of the damage, we can have different attitudes vis-a-vis religious buildings. We can say that there is a prevailing approach that we may define as philological reconstructive, but it is not the only approach that is used, as we've seen. Then we move on with this reflection and we try to acquire further indications by analyzing accurately the international documents that address issues that are relevant for us, for our reflection. So let's speak about the standards, the charters, the recommendations, the national and international documents. In particular, in this case, these are international documents that are like a synthesis of a certain culture that expresses itself through some criteria and standards and indications for the activities of conservation of architectures. I will quote some of them. Let's start with something. This is a selection that includes the most significant ones, meaning that there are numerous documents, there are hundreds of documents, and often, I must say it, they repeat themselves, they're redundant at times. It is not very interesting to read them, but we have to make an effort here because they represent a tendency. They are a way to analyze a common conception of culture in a certain field in relation to a specific topic, that is the one of protection. So we will have to necessarily start from the first international document, that is the one of 1931, the so-called Athens Charter. The Athens Charter actually is important because it shows a fracture that occurred between the modalities of architecture and design and the modalities of restoration that had been developing up until the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. The world has changed. The ways in which buildings are designed have changed. Construction technologies have changed. And so the attitude and the practices of conservation of architecture of the past have to change. So in this sense, the document that is here, and you can see a passage that is highlighted. This is the first point on the doctrines and general principles. It reads that the conference had a statement of the general principles regarding the conceptual documents. The conference noted that whatever made a variety of concrete cases, each of which are open to a different solution. The conference noted that there predominates in the different countries represented a general tendency to abandon restorations in thought and to avoid attendant dangers by initiating a system of regular and permanent maintenance calculated to ensure the preservation of the buildings, meaning that the document notes the fact that it is possible to abandon, to stop the activity of restorations in toto of architectures. And indeed, in the following paragraphs, it reads, when, as a result of decay or destruction, restoration appears to be indispensable. It wasn't talking about war events in this case, because these are the 30s, but we can apply to war events. It recommends that the historic and artistic work of the past should be respected without excluding the style of any given period. And here, a certain issue is specified, meaning the issue of conservation of the pre-existing part and the need or opportunity to avoid selecting what already exists in the architecture of the past. Instead, it should be preserved in its entirety. Then there are other issues that are covered, but in relation to our reflection, this is the central point. Then we can move to this other part of our reflection, which is related to a document that was drafted some years after the end of the Second World War. That is the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. This was drafted in The Hague in 1954. It is not a document that has special contents in terms of procedures of conservation and the goals and the methods of conservation, but it highlights a need that has become urgent after the events of the Second World War, meaning that that a central aspect should be taken into consideration, meaning the document invites the parties, meaning the countries, the nations, to commit to mutually respect cultural property. So in case of armed conflict, each nation, even if it is a party in the war, should respect the cultural property of the countries with which it is at war. So, it is a document that is important because it expresses this need to develop a system of protection which goes beyond the borders of the single countries. Instead, it should recognize that cultural property is a heritage that goes beyond the borders of the nations. This document recently, in 2015, was updated. Here they speak about reinforcement of protection systems in the event of armed conflict. So it is a topic that is still being treated and it still inspires reflection and updates. But this said, instead, it is necessary to focus on the following document that is a central document in terms of the reflections of the international documents. That is the Restoration Charter, that is the Venice Charter of 1964. Here we could say that this document, after the results of the experience of the activities of restoration and reconstruction after the serious damages of the Second World War, tries to specify some things that are considered fundamental for the proper approach to the built heritage. Here, we might avoid getting into much details as regards the definitions, and we could move straight to the main issues which also support the reflection that we are making. In particular, there is the chapter on restoration. It includes Article 9, which reads that the restoration is a process that should be extraordinary. Its aim is to preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historic value of the monument, and is based on respect. And that